Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stared in disbelief from the deck of the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi on the morning of June 4, 1942. Just moments earlier, he had been celebrating what seemed like the perfect execution of Japan's ambitious plan to eliminate America's remaining carrier force at Midway. Now, through billowing smoke and flames, he watched as his proud flagship, the centerpiece of the Imperial Japanese Navy's seemingly invincible carrier force, transformed into a funeral pyre. What Fuchida witnessed in those chaotic minutes defied 3 years of unquestioned Japanese naval supremacy and propaganda. The carrier force that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had once boasted could run wild across the Pacific for 6 months was now facing annihilation in less than 6 minutes. Fuchida clutched the railing as another explosion rocked the massive vessel. In that moment, he understood a devastating truth. The mighty Imperial Japanese Navy had catastrophically underestimated its American enemy. Just 3 hours earlier, Fuchida and his fellow officers had gathered in the wardroom of the Akagi, confidently reviewing intelligence reports and final attack plans. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the 1st Carrier Division and veteran of Pearl Harbor, had permitted himself a rare smile as he studied the tactical map. "The Americans are predictable," he remarked to his staff. "They will sacrifice their remaining carriers exactly as we have planned." Captain Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical architect behind both Pearl Harbor and the Midway operation, nodded in agreement. "Their carrier doctrine is primitive compared to ours," he added. "They have neither the pilots nor the experience." "To challenge the combined fleet?" The assembled officers murmured their approval. After all, the Kirobutai, Japan's elite carrier strike force, had reigned supreme across the Pacific and Indian Oceans for 6 months, destroying or damaging 8 Allied battleships, 1 aircraft carrier, 9 cruisers, and numerous smaller vessels without losing a single fleet carrier. This supreme confidence was not merely the product of recent victories. It reflected decades of Japanese naval doctrine and preparation. Since the 1920s, the Imperial Japanese Navy had focused its considerable resources on developing the world's most advanced carrier tactics and technologies. Japanese naval aviators underwent rigorous training programs lasting 2 to 3 years, far longer than their American counterparts. By 1942, Japan's carrier pilots averaged 700 hours of flight time, compared to the mere 200 hours typical of American naval aviators. The Japanese A6M0 fighter was widely acknowledged as the most maneuverable fighter aircraft in the world, outclassing anything in the American inventory. Most significantly, the Japanese had pioneered the concept of the massed carrier strike force, concentrating 4 to 6 carriers in a single formation to deliver overwhelming air power against enemy fleets. The Japanese carrier admirals had particular reason to dismiss American carrier capabilities. In April 1942, Vice Admiral William Bull Halsey had led the USS Enterprise and USS Hornet on the audacious Doolittle raid against Tokyo. While the raid caused minimally physical damage, it represented an unacceptable loss of face for Japan's military leadership. Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, seized upon the Americans' bold move to justify his long-desired decisive battle in the Central Pacific. "The Americans are desperate and reckless," Yamamoto told the Naval General Staff. "They will commit their remaining carriers to defend Midway, and we will destroy them." The Naval General Staff, initially reluctant to divert resources from the ongoing southern offensive toward Australia, eventually acquiesced to Yamamoto's plan, a complex operation involving 8 separate task forces and 272 ships stretched across the vast Pacific. The Japanese plan for Midway reflected their supreme confidence in their carrier force's superiority. While most of the combined fleet would participate in the operation, the tip of the spear remained Nagumo's 1st Carrier Division, the 4 fleet carriers that had devastated Pearl Harbor: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These 4 carriers embarked over 250 aircraft and the cream of Japan's naval aviation, pilots with combat experience stretching back to operations in China in the mid-1930s. By contrast, American carrier strength in the Pacific had been reduced to just 3 fleet carriers after the loss of USS Lexington at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May. One of those, USS Yorktown, had been severely damaged in the same battle and was expected to require months of repairs at Pearl Harbor. Intelligence estimates presented to Admiral Yamamoto and his staff projected that the Americans would have at most 2 operational carriers available for the defense of Midway. Even this estimate was considered pessimistic by many staff officers, who believed the Americans would be reluctant to risk their precious remaining carriers against Japan's proven carrier force. Lieutenant Commander Yasuji Watanabe, Yamamoto's intelligence officer, noted in his staff diary, "There was a prevailing view that the Americans lacked both the will and the capability to engage our carrier force directly. Most believed they would attempt to defend Midway with land-based aircraft alone, preserving their carriers for the defense of Hawaii." On the eve of the operation, Admiral Nagumo hosted a final strategy dinner aboard his flagship Akagi. According to Lieutenant Masatake Okumiya, who was present, the mood was one of absolute certainty. There was no discussion of potential American strength or tactics, Okumiya later wrote. The entire conversation centered on how quickly we would secure victory and whether the Americans would even attempt to defend Midway with their carriers. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commander of the 2nd Carrier Division, proposed a toast: "To the American carriers, may they be brave enough to face us." The assembled officers laughed appreciatively. None suspected that within 72 hours all 4 of their magnificent carriers would lie at the bottom of the Pacific, and Admiral Yamaguchi himself would choose to go down with his flagship rather than face the shame of defeat. The Japanese confidence stemmed not merely from their recent string of victories, but from a fundamental misunderstanding of American industrial capacity and national character. In the 6 months since Pearl Harbor, the United States had launched a massive industrial mobilization unprecedented in human history. American shipyards were working around the clock 7 days a week. The Brooklyn Navy Yard alone employed 70,000 workers on 3 shifts. New aircraft carriers were being constructed in as little as 16 months, half the time required before the war. At the massive Newport News shipbuilding yard in Virginia, 27,000 workers labored day and night on new Essex-class carriers that would begin joining the fleet in 1943. Even more remarkably, American industry had managed to repair the supposedly crippled USS Yorktown in just 48 hours at Pearl Harbor, a feat that Japanese naval engineers estimated would require at least 2 months in their most advanced facilities. When Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, inspected the hastily repaired Yorktown before she sailed for Midway, he asked Captain Elliot Buckmaster how the ship was handling. "She's held together with baling wire and chewing gum," Buckmaster reportedly replied, "but she'll fight." This rapid repair of Yorktown would prove decisive in the coming battle, giving the Americans 3 carriers against Japan's 4, odds that the Japanese leadership had considered impossible. On May 27, 1942, Admiral Yamamoto led the massive Japanese armada out of the inland sea, confident that his complex plan would unfold precisely as designed. The operation involved multiple deception measures, including a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands designed to draw American naval forces northward, away from Midway. Yamamoto himself commanded the main body, centered around the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, trailing hundreds of miles behind Nagumo's carrier force. This separation of forces reflected Yamamoto's continued attachment to battleship doctrine, despite his pioneering use of carriers. He envisioned the carriers softening up American defenses before his battleships delivered the coup de grace in a climactic surface engagement, the decisive battle that generations of Japanese naval officers had trained for. As the Japanese fleet approached Midway, unknown to them, American code breakers had achieved a remarkable intelligence coup. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had partially broken the Japanese naval code, JN-25, and had determined the target and timing of the Japanese operation. This critical intelligence allowed Admiral Nimitz to position his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway, where they could ambush the approaching Japanese carrier force. When Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet, learned of the Japanese approach on June 3rd, he reportedly told his staff, "They expect to surprise us. Instead, we're going to surprise them." Dawn on June 4th found the Japanese carrier force approximately 200 miles northwest of Midway, launching their initial strike against the American base there. Admiral Nagumo had held back half of his aircraft as a reserve force, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs in case American naval forces were discovered. This decision, fully aligned with Japanese naval doctrine, emphasizing flexibility, would soon prove disastrous. At 0730 hours, a Japanese scout plane from the cruiser Tone reported sighting 10 enemy surface ships, but failed to identify any carriers. 16 minutes later, the scout sent an additional message: enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. This report triggered a crisis in Nagumo's command center. The initial Midway strike force was returning and needed to land. The reserve strike force, already armed with torpedoes for naval targets, would need to be rearmed with bombs suitable for land targets if Nagumo decided to launch a second strike against Midway. Alternatively, they could be sent immediately against the reported American ships with their existing torpedo armament. After some hesitation, Nagumo ordered the reserve aircraft to be rearmed with bombs for a second Midway strike, a process that would take considerable time as ordnance had to be returned to magazines deep in the carriers' hulls and replaced with different weapons. This fateful decision coincided with the first American attacks from Midway-based aircraft, which, though ineffective, forced the Japanese carriers to engage in defensive maneuvering and delayed flight operations. By the time Nagumo reversed his decision and ordered the reserve aircraft to be rearmed again with torpedoes for attacking the American naval force, his flight decks were crowded with returning aircraft from the Midway strike. Fuel hoses snaked across the decks, and ordnance was stacked in preparation for rearming operations. The Japanese carriers were caught in their most vulnerable state, decks crowded with aircraft, fuel, and munitions, when American carrier aircraft finally located them at approximately 0920 hours. The American strike was led by torpedo bombers, slow, vulnerable aircraft that attacked at low altitude. 37 of these obsolescent aircraft from the 3 American carriers attacked the Japanese formation in succession, and in a devastating demonstration of Japanese fighter superiority and anti-aircraft fire, 35 were shot down without scoring a single hit. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led 15 torpedo bombers from USS Hornet in the first attack. Only 1 pilot survived, and none of their torpedoes found targets. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led 14 torpedo bombers from USS Enterprise. Only 4 aircraft survived. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey led 12 torpedo bombers from USS Yorktown. Only 2 returned. From the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo watched with satisfaction as the American torpedo bombers were systematically destroyed. "I have never seen such courage in the face of certain death," he reportedly remarked to his chief of staff. But courage alone cannot overcome superior force. What neither Nagumo nor any other Japanese officer realized was that the seemingly futile attacks had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to wave-top height, leaving the airspace above the carriers momentarily undefended. At precisely This moment, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey arrived above the Japanese formation with 33 dive bombers from USS Enterprise, and Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie arrived with 17 dive bombers from USS Yorktown. Looking down from 18,000 feet, McCluskey saw the Japanese carriers below, their decks crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance. Unlike the torpedo bombers, dive bombers attacked from high altitude, plunging nearly vertically toward their targets before releasing their 1,000-pound bombs. At 0925, McCluskey's dive bombers began their attack runs on Kaga and Akagi, while Leslie's squadron targeted Soryu. What followed in the next 5 minutes would fundamentally alter the course of the Pacific War and expose the fatal flaws in Japan's carrier doctrine and strategic thinking. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Enterprise's Bombing 6 Squadron, selected the flagship Akagi as his target. As he pushed his SBD Dauntless into a steep dive, he later recalled, thinking, "This is for Pearl Harbor." Best's 1,000-pound bomb pierced Akagi's flight deck near the midship elevator and detonated in the hangar deck below, igniting fueled and armed aircraft. Almost simultaneously, 3 bombs struck Kaga, while Soryu was hit by 3 bombs from Yorktown's dive bombers. Within minutes, all 3 Japanese carriers were transformed into raging infernos. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, temporarily escaped detection and launched a counterattack that damaged USS Yorktown, but was herself discovered and destroyed by American dive bombers late that afternoon. Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier, was recovering from appendicitis in the Akagi's sickbay when the American bombs struck. Making his way to the flight deck, he witnessed the apocalyptic transformation of Japan's proud carrier force. The proud Akagi, which had until a few minutes ago been the picture of offensive power, he later wrote, was now a helpless hulk, burning fiercely without a single plane able to take off. Within hours, 3 of the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor had been abandoned and scuttled. Hiryu would follow them to the bottom that evening. The Japanese had lost 4 fleet carriers, 332 aircraft, and over 2,000 experienced aviators and sailors, including many irreplaceable veteran pilots. The Americans lost 1 carrier, the already damaged Yorktown, 1 destroyer, and 147 aircraft. The shock that rippled through the Japanese command structure was profound. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving reports aboard his flagship, Yamato, hundreds of miles away, maintained outward composure, but recognized immediately the strategic implications. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," he had supposedly remarked after Pearl Harbor. Now those prophetic words seemed to be coming true with stunning rapidity. Lieutenant Commander Watanabe recorded in his diary that night, "The Admiral sat in silence for a long time after receiving confirmation of the 4th carrier's loss. Finally, he said, 'This is not merely a tactical defeat. This may well be the turning point of the entire war.'" For the Japanese naval leadership, the most shocking aspect of the defeat was not merely the loss of 4 irreplaceable carriers, but the revelation that their fundamental assumptions about American capabilities had been catastrophically wrong. They had believed American intelligence was primitive. Instead, it had precisely anticipated their plans. They had believed American carriers were operated by inexperienced crews following outdated doctrine. Instead, American carrier tactics had evolved rapidly and had been executed with deadly effectiveness. They had believed American industrial capacity was insufficient to repair major warships quickly. Instead, the Yorktown had been made combat-ready in mere days. They had believed American pilots lacked the skill and determination to challenge the veterans of the Kido Butai. Instead, American aviators had pressed home their attacks with suicidal determination and decisive skill. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, recovering from his wounds aboard the cruiser Nagara after being evacuated from the doomed Akagi, attempted to make sense of the disaster. "We had become overconfident," he later wrote. "We had come to believe that the Americans were soft and unwilling to accept casualties. We had convinced ourselves that their industrial strength was exaggerated. But most fatally, we had assumed that they would react according to our expectations rather than surprising us with their adaptability and determination." The strategic consequences of Midway extended far beyond the loss of 4 carriers. The battle marked the end of Japanese offensive operations in the Pacific and the beginning of a long, grueling defensive struggle against mounting American power. Within days of the battle, Admiral Yamamoto was forced to cancel the planned invasion of Midway and withdraw his remaining forces. Plans for further operations against New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa were permanently abandoned. The initiative in the Pacific War had irrevocably shifted to the Americans. Perhaps most devastating for Japan's long-term prospects was the loss of aircrew experience. Unlike the Americans, who rotated experienced pilots home to train new aviators, the Japanese kept their best pilots in continuous combat operations until they were killed. The aviators lost at Midway represented the cream of Japanese naval aviation, men with years of training and combat experience dating back to operations in China. Lieutenant Commander Takashige Igusa, one of Japan's most skilled dive bomber pilots and a veteran of Pearl Harbor, was severely wounded. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who led the Midway strike, was shot down and killed. These irreplaceable veterans could not be adequately replaced despite frantic efforts to accelerate pilot hours, training programs. The contrast between Japanese and American approaches to aircrew management was stark and revealing. In the 6 months following Midway, the United States would commission 7 new flight training centers and expand its naval aviation training program to produce over 20,000 pilots annually by 1943. Japan, with its smaller population and industrial base, could never match this output. By 1944, Japanese replacement pilots would receive less than 300 hours of flight training before entering combat against American pilots with 450 hours of training. The quality gap that had favored Japan so decisively in 1941 and early 1942 would be completely reversed by 1944. Even more astonishing to the Japanese leadership was the American shipbuilding response. In the 18 months following Midway, American shipyards would launch 9 new Essex-class fleet carriers and 9 smaller Independence-class light carriers. Japan, by contrast, would complete only 3 new fleet carriers during the entire war. By 1944, the U.S. Navy would field a carrier force larger than all other navies in the world combined. The industrial mobilization that made this possible was already underway when the Japanese admirals were confidently mocking American carrier capabilities at Midway. Commander Masatake Okumaya, who survived the sinking of Soryu, later reflected on the psychological impact of Midway on Japan's naval leadership. "We had built our entire strategy on the assumption of Japanese qualitative superiority compensating for American quantitative advantages. Midway destroyed not only our carriers, but this fundamental strategic concept. We suddenly realized that the Americans could match and exceed our quality, while simultaneously overwhelming us with quantity. This realization was more devastating than the military defeat itself." The psychological transformation extended to the highest levels of Japanese leadership. Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, wrote in his diary on June 6, "This war will not be easy. We have underestimated the enemy's potential strength and determination." Emperor Hirohito, upon receiving the official report of the battle, reportedly asked, "How could this happen to the invincible combined fleet?" The Naval General Staff had no satisfactory answer. For the American leadership, Midway confirmed what they had believed but could not yet prove, that American industry, technology, and fighting spirit could overcome initial Japanese advantages. Admiral Nimitz, in his official report, highlighted the courage of the torpedo bomber squadrons that had sacrificed themselves to set up the decisive dive bomber attacks. They pressed home their attacks with great determination, he wrote, in the face of tremendous anti-aircraft fire and overwhelming fighter opposition. They were living examples of the Navy's slogan, "Don't give up the ship." President Franklin D. Roosevelt, recognizing the strategic significance of the victory, wanted to announce it immediately to bolster public morale. Navy leadership persuaded him to delay the announcement to protect the secret of America's code-breaking success. When the victory was finally announced on June 6, 1942, it was presented as the result of courage and determination rather than intelligence. Advantages. The American public, still reeling from 6 months of defeats across the Pacific, embraced the victory as evidence that the tide had turned. For Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, whose perfectly placed bomb had mortally wounded the Akagi of the Keys, victory came at a personal cost. Breathing hot gases during the battle damaged his lungs, ending his flying career. When interviewed decades later, he reflected, "The Japanese pilots at Midway were probably better than we were, and they certainly had better aircraft. But we had surprise on our side, and we had trained to work as a team. Most importantly, we believed we could win despite the odds." This combination of factors, surprise, teamwork, and determination, had allowed a numerically inferior American force to achieve one of the most lopsided victories in naval history. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff struggled to explain the disaster without admitting the extent of the losses. Initial announcements claimed that Japan had sunk 2 American carriers while losing only one of their own. Only gradually did the Japanese public learn fragments of the truth, and the full extent of the defeat was not officially acknowledged until after the war. This pattern of deception would continue throughout the conflict, widening the gap between Japan's propaganda and reality until the final devastating bombing campaigns against the Japanese homeland in 1945. Perhaps the most profound transformation occurred among the surviving Japanese naval officers who had witnessed the disaster firsthand. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius behind Pearl Harbor, who had confidently dismissed American carrier capabilities, became an advocate for fundamental reform of Japanese naval aviation. "We must completely rebuild our approach," he argued in a report submitted in July 1942. "The Americans learn and adapt more quickly than we anticipated. We must do the same or face certain defeat." His recommendations included establishing a rotation system for combat air crews, accelerating carrier construction, and developing new aircraft types to counter improving American designs. Admiral Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier force at both Pearl Harbor and Midway, never recovered from the psychological impact of the defeat. Relieved of carrier command, he was eventually assigned to the defense of Saipan in the Marianas. When American forces overwhelmed the island's defenses in July 1944, Nagumo committed suicide rather than face the shame of capture. His final message to Imperial headquarters reportedly included the words, "The defeat at Midway was the beginning of our end. I go now to apologize to the spirits of our aviators who fell that day." The battle's impact extended far beyond military considerations into fundamental questions about national character and industrial capacity. Midway exposed the fatal flaws in Japan's strategic thinking, particularly the belief that spiritual factors and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya later wrote, "We had convinced ourselves that the American fighting man was soft and would break under pressure. Midway taught us that American courage was equal to our own. We had convinced ourselves that American industrial power was exaggerated. Midway was the first demonstration of its actual capabilities." These revelations were more shocking than the tactical defeat itself. In the weeks following Midway, American intelligence intercepted and decoded revealing communications among Japanese naval commanders. In one message, an unnamed staff officer wrote, "We must reconsider our entire strategic concept. The Americans have shown they can replace losses more quickly than anticipated and have demonstrated tactical innovations we did not expect. If this trend continues, the long-term prospects for victory are diminishing." This sober assessment contrasted sharply with the confident predictions that had characterized Japanese planning before Midway. The industrial disparity that would ultimately determine the outcome of the Pacific War was already becoming apparent. By the time the Battle of Midway ended, American shipyards had 27 aircraft carriers of various types under construction. The Essex-class carriers, first ordered in 1940, would begin joining the fleet in 1943. Each displaced 27,000 tons and could operate over 90 aircraft, far more than the Japanese carriers lost at Midway. Behind these capital ships came hundreds of destroyers, submarines, and auxiliary vessels, all produced by an industrial base that was still expanding. Japan, having committed its limited resources to the initial offensive, had no comparable construction program and increasingly lacked the raw materials to maintain even existing production levels as American submarines began targeting Japanese shipping. For the survivors of the Japanese carrier force, the months following Midway were a time of painful reassessment. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, a Zero pilot who had participated in both Pearl Harbor and Midway, later recalled, "After Pearl Harbor, we believed we were invincible. After Midway, we understood we were defeated, though the war would continue for 3 more years." This sentiment, that Midway had effectively decided the outcome of the war despite the long struggle that followed, was widely shared among informed Japanese naval officers, though rarely expressed publicly during the conflict. American assessments were similarly prescient. Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, wrote in his post-war memoir, "Midway was the first decisive defeat suffered by the Japanese Navy in 350 years. It marked the turning point of the war in the Pacific because it stopped Japanese expansion and put them on the defensive. From a strategic point of view, it was the most important battle of the Pacific War." The historical significance of those 5 fateful minutes when American dive bombers transformed 4 Japanese carriers from offensive weapons to flaming wrecks cannot be overstated. In that brief span of time, the momentum of the Pacific War shifted irrevocably. The Japanese admirals, who had mockingly toasted to the bravery of American carriers on the eve of battle, received a devastating lesson in the dangers of overconfidence and the folly of underestimating an industrialized democracy aroused to full mobilization. For Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who survived the sinking of Akagi and lived to witness Japan's ultimate defeat, the lesson of Midway was both military and philosophical. In his post-war writings, he reflected, "At Midway we lost more than 4 carriers. We lost our sense of invincibility, we lost the initiative, and perhaps most importantly, we lost our strategic illusions." The Japan that entered the war believed in its spiritual superiority over the materialistic West. Midway began the painful process of teaching us that industrial capacity and technological innovation, combined with courage and determination, would inevitably triumph over even the most dedicated fighting spirit. The legacy of Midway extended far beyond the immediate strategic reversal. It fundamentally altered how both sides viewed the conflict and each other. For the Japanese, it was the first step in a painful journey from confidence to desperation, from offensive operations to increasingly futile defensive measures. For the Americans, it was confirmation that their industrial might, combined with courage and tactical innovation, could overcome initial disadvantages. The battle vindicated the pre-war American emphasis on aircraft carriers over battleships and accelerated the revolution in naval warfare that had begun at Pearl Harbor. In the decades following the war, both American and Japanese naval historians would study Midway as a case study in the dangers of overconfidence and the decisive impact of intelligence advantages. The battle has been described as a miracle by some American commentators, but this characterization obscures the systematic advantages that made the American victory possible: superior intelligence, rapidly evolving tactics, industrial strength, and the courage of the men who executed the attack. Seen in this light, Midway represents not a miracle, but the inevitable result when strategic hubris confronts industrial reality. The Japanese admirals who mockingly toasted American carrier capabilities on the eve of Midway could not have imagined that within 3 years, the American carrier force would grow to include 28 fleet carriers and 71 escort carriers, supported by a naval air arm of over 40,000 aircraft. Nor could they have foreseen that Japanese cities would lie in ruins, the Imperial Navy would cease to exist as an effective fighting force, and Japan itself would face imminent invasion. Yet all these outcomes became inevitable in those 5 crucial minutes at Midway, when the invincible Kitabutai was revealed to be all too vulnerable, and the supposedly inferior American carriers demonstrated their decisive potential. In the final analysis, Midway stands as one of history's most dramatic revelations of the danger of believing one's own propaganda. The Japanese naval leadership, convinced of their qualitative superiority and contemptuous of American capabilities, created a strategic vulnerability that their enemies exploited with devastating effectiveness. The price of this miscalculation was not merely 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers, but ultimately Japan's position as an independent great power. The admirals who mocked American carriers before Midway would live, those who survived, to see American carrier task forces operating with impunity off the coast of Japan itself, delivering the final blows to an empire built on overconfidence and strategic miscalculation.